Hi everyone, Tom from Medical Mavericks here, and this is our impromptu video on COVID-19 and how it actually affects the body, its mechanism of action, but ultimately we're going to look at how it affects the body and results in death. So it's a bit of a grim video, it is what it is. We're going to look at the mechanics of how it works. Apologies on wearing a hat today. I've got serious kind of lockdown hair. This is a bit of an impromptu video, so I've not had a chance to style my hair appropriately for a video today, so I'm wearing a hat. But this is kind of what we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to start at the end, and we're going to look at three things that actually result in death, and look at how those things arise through the actual infection. So I'm going to jump over onto my iPad here, and the biggest thing that results in the death of someone is this multisystem organ failure, and that happens because of three things. You have something called a decrease in your blood pressure. That's not good for your organs. You have a decrease in your blood volume, which isn't good. And you might be thinking, why is blood volume going to decrease when we're looking at something respiratory? You'll find out as we go through. And we have something called a decrease in perfusion. And this is basically the delivery of oxygen to our organs. I'll put two organs, it makes sense there. Okay, so ultimately what's happening here is your organs start to fail because they're not having enough oxygen delivered to them. That's what results in organ failure, and that's what results in your death. So what we're going to look at is, how does all of these three things happen? Why does your blood pressure drop? Why does your blood volume drop? And why does your perfusion drop? Why do your organs have a reduction in oxygen delivery? And to do that, we're going to start with the virus here. This is a very, very, very basic picture of a virus, okay? And we're going to look at three things on here. We've got on the outside, we've got these, what we call glycoproteins. I want you to think of these as a kind of like a key that can go into a lock. We've got this kind of outer membrane or shell here, and then this green wiggly line here. Whoops-a-daisy, don't want to do that. There we go. This green wiggly line here, this is something called RNA, or ribonucleic acid. Okay, and I want you to think about this as being a bit like an instruction manual for the DNA. So this contains all the information that the virus needs to make itself. It's like an instruction book on how to build a virus. Okay, our DNA in our cells is exactly the same, but it's much more complex, and our DNA is basically an instruction book for every process that goes on in our body, how to build every type of cell, every type of protein, every type of molecule we need to use. All of that is contained within our DNA, but it's much more complex than the RNA. Okay, so this is our basic virus we've got here. We've got our glycoproteins on the outside. We've got our membrane going around the outside, and on the inside we've got our RNA, our instruction manual. Okay, now this virus affects our respiratory system, so we breathe in air droplets with the virus in it, and it goes into our trachea down here, into our bronchus, into our bronchioles. If you watched my video on the lungs the other day, you would have kind of seen inside mine in that procedure. I had the bronchoscopy, and it goes right to the end of those tubes, and at the end of the tubes we've got something here called our alveoli. Okay, now our alveoli are very important because it is where our oxygen, I'm drawing some capillaries here, this is deoxygenated blood coming in, and what happens is oxygen can transfer from the alveoli into your bloodstream to oxygenate it, and that gets circulated around your body. Okay, so that's the basics of an alveoli. Okay, you've got lots of blood vessels, the tiny capillaries wrapping around them, and oxygen can move into that bloodstream, and carbon dioxide moves out into the alveoli, and you breathe that out. Okay, if we want to zoom in a little bit on a single alveoli, this is kind of what it looks like. We can see there are some key points here. So these here are cells. So this is your alveoli is it's 1 cell thick. Okay, so it's really thin. We don't want to have like a big gap and lots of cells for oxygen to go through. We want oxygen to be able to move across here really easily. And this is our capillary. This is our blood in here. Okay, and the cells that we are really interested in are these big ones here. Okay, and these cells are called type 2 pneumocytes, and I've drawn one here. You can tell I passed my art exams at university. I didn't really. This is our type 2 pneumocyte, and this is a special cell that lives inside the alveoli. Every alveoli have several of these in there. Okay, and their main function in your lungs is to produce something called surfactant. Okay, and this surfactant is produced, and if I go back up to my alveoli and just zoom in a little bit, this surfactant is produced to kind of coat the inside of the alveoli like this. Okay, and what it does, it helps the alveoli like not stick together, because it's going to be damp in there because the air is kind of moist, but it stops the alveoli kind of sticking together when you kind of breathe in and out. If you think of a balloon and you get the inside of a balloon wet and it sticks together and you try and blow it back up, it's really hard to do. So this surfactant kind of helps with the elasticity and the stretchiness of your alveoli. So it makes it really easy for you to breathe. That's a really important point for you to remember. Surfactant helps the alveoli become really stretchy and not stick together when air is kind of being exhaled out. Okay, so that is what we're looking at here. Let me bring this back up into size and shape so we can draw on it properly. There we go. So these produce surfactants, so they're really important. But on the outside of our pneumocyte, we've got this thing here. Okay, and this orange kind of blob I've drawn here is called ACE. And if you want to know what the actual word of that is, I want to write it just up here. It's called angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay, and this enzyme is really important for converting something called angiotensin 1 into something called angiotensin 2. Okay, it's a really simple process. Angiotensin 1 is produced when you have kind of a low blood volume, low blood pressure, and this enzyme turns it into angiotensin 2, which has an effect on trying to raise your blood pressure. That is not important for this whole process, but that enzyme there is where the virus enters into the cell. Okay, so this enzyme here, which is normally used as this converting enzyme, is actually where the virus ends up entering the cell. And I forgot to turn my mobile phone off there. So now I've turned my phone off. This is how the virus enters the cell. So we've got our virus here, and it's these glycoproteins, these little keys that I talked about earlier on, interact with the ACE enzyme here, and that results in some kind of entry process into the cell. I'm not sure what that is. I'll try to have a look around at what that mechanism might be, but it's some kind of something called Endo Cytosis. Okay, Endo Cytosis. Endo means into, so it's been brought into the cell. Okay, now this is where viruses become really fascinating, and I know this is a serious condition, but it is really amazing how a virus basically takes over a cell's infrastructure inside to basically turn this type 2 pneumocyte into a virus producing cell. It's really amazing. It is, but this is kind of how it works. So when the virus comes in, it kind of unwraps, it envelops, it unwraps itself, and that little strand of RNA that we talked about, that green wiggly line that we drew inside, okay, that is the instruction manual, remember. And two things happen here. We're going to draw some bits of infrastructure. Let's choose a colour. Let's go with pink here. Okay, so I'm going to draw something called a a ribosome. Okay, you might remember this from your science lessons. That's my very quickly drawn ribosome. Not anatomically accurate at all, it's just there for you to look at. Okay, so what happens is a ribosome, I'm going to write it under here, a ribosome is basically a protein producing factory. Okay, it basically reads the RNA and makes a protein. It reads instructions on the RNA and a protein is made out of it. So this is almost like a little reader that goes through there like that, and out the other side we get proteins. Okay, now one of the proteins that comes off this like little conveyor belt, I'm going to draw another one up here. Let's do an orange one this time. It's called RDRP. Okay, I'm going to draw it up here. I'm going to draw it as like a box, and I'm going to RDRP. Okay, and that stands for, I'm going to read it off my piece of paper because it's quite long. RNA dependent RNA polymerase. Okay, RNA dependent RNA polymerase. Now, what that basically does, it's like a photocopier for the viral RNA. Okay, so this, oops, wrong colour, there we go. So this RNA here, I'm going to write RNA on it, so there we go, RNA. This instruction manual basically goes through this system, across this enzyme, and basically becomes like a photocopier, and it just makes multiple copies of the RNA that's going to go inside the new viruses. And these proteins down here that have been made are all the basic building blocks that are needed. I'm just drawing lots of squiggly lines here for building blocks to make a protein. And essentially what happens here is all of these kind of instructions and all these proteins kind of overtake the cell, and the cell becomes this factory, and eventually what happens is the viruses, I've drawn some viruses up here, make them a bit smaller, are put together, and viruses start to build up inside the cell. Okay, so we've got two things going on. We've got our ribosome down here making all the proteins and all the little bits and pieces needed to build a virus. Okay, and also a little photocopier for the RNA. And this RDRP is the photocopy that makes the RNA into all these strands here, ready for the new viruses, and they all get enveloped into the new viruses. And then eventually, what happens is these viruses get released out of the cell by some process. Okay. Now, I don't know if this cell then dies with the release of all these viruses, or whether, like for example, a HIV virus, the virus lives in certain cells, certain white blood cells, and they bud off. They kind of just bud off and come out the cell. Okay, so the cell doesn't die. Whereas some viruses kind of fill the cell, and all of a sudden the cell kind of bursts, and the virus kind of is released into circulation. I'm not sure why which round that is, but I would assume it's kind of released on a slow basis. Okay, but that's, I don't know. I might have to look that up for you. Okay, so that's how the virus is made. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? That the virus comes in, uses the cell's own infrastructure. So this ribosome down here, this here actually belongs to the cell. Okay. Whereas this one here, this is virus made. So the virus comes in, takes over the cell kind of machinery, but then makes its own machinery to help the process as well. This is why they're just quite fascinating and very dangerous. Okay. Now then, what happens once these are in circulation and going through it? So what we have to do is come down to our alveoli here. So this is all one alveoli, and we've got our bloodstream coming along here. I'm just going to write blood in here so we know this is blood coming along here into there. Okay, so let's put some viruses in our kind of system. So we've got some viruses in our system now, and several things are going to happen. Once we know we have got our kind of infection okay, our immune system kicks in. Okay, and the first thing that's going to appear are, I'm going to draw them in blue. Okay, I'm going to draw one up here so we can write the name next to it. How do we draw this? I'm just going to draw a big kind of blob in the middle because that's what they kind of look like under a microscope, with some dots in there. That's a really accurate drawing again. Okay, this is a neutrophil. Okay, this is a type of white blood cell that lives in our blood. Okay, and they're the first on the scene. Okay, and they kind of recognise when we've got some kind of infection, and they start to affect and kind of help the area that's infected. Okay, they mainly though attack bacteria and fungus, so I'm not too sure what effect they have on our viruses, but they normally affect bacteria and fungi. Okay, so those come in, and then we also have, let's go with this one here. In here, we also have some macrophages. So a macrophage likes to gobble up things that are infecting the body. They envelop them, break them down into smaller pieces, and dissolve them away. However, the presence of our immune system, both our macrophage here and our neutrophil, results in the release of certain chemicals from the immune system, chemokines or interleukins. These are little chemicals that help coordinate a process of our immune system. They're like little signals and instructions that either attract more cells in. Think of them as like a scent for other immune systems to kind of sniff out and find where the problem is. It'd be in a really high concentration around the infected area, and as they kind of spread out, they get weaker in concentration. So our white blood cells can come in and kind of sniff them out and get closer to the kind of infected area. And there's several of these that get kind of released. I'm going to write some of them on here. So we've got something called IL-1, we've got IL-6, and something called TNF-alpha. Okay, IL is an interleukin, and they help coordinate an immune response. Okay, so we've got numbers 1 and 6 here. I'm just going to find my notes of what we're looking at here. So these help coordinate different cells and attract more immune system cells in, and TNF is something called tumor necrosis factor. Okay, and this is actually something called a pyrogen. It helps elevate our body temperature. So these chemicals here get released and they actually enter our bloodstream. Okay, they have some local effects in this area as well, which I'll talk about in a minute, but as these are in the bloodstream, they end up going to part of the brain called, I'm going to colour it in here, called the hypothalamus. Okay, and so these go all the way down here. They have an effect on the hypothalamus, and what happens here is we get an increase in body temperature. So this is why your temperature goes up. Okay, this is our raised temperature that you kind of see talked about with this virus. However, in and around your alveoli, I'm going to do this in blue. You also get something. You get an increase in permeability of these cells and this kind of area here. So what actually happens is, I'm going to get rid of some of these arrows so we can draw a little bit more clearly. Okay, what happens is the liquid part of your blood, I'm just going to draw it in blue, okay, starts to leak into the area between your alveoli and the blood, and it starts to leak into your alveoli. So you start to get a build-up of fluid inside the alveoli, around the alveoli. Okay, which is very dangerous, because remember what these areas are for. So we get We want to get the oxygen into our blood, and we want to get our carbon dioxide out of our blood. But that doesn't happen because we've got this fluid building up between the alveoli and within the alveoli space. Okay. This is called alveolar, I've got to spell this right, edema. Edema is a build-up of fluid, and we're getting it in the alveolar space. What ultimately happens is we get a reduction in what's called our PO2, basically our oxygen saturation. So our oxygen levels basically fall because we're not getting the oxygen into our blood. So we've now got a reduction in our oxygen saturation. Okay, and we've also got a buildup of fluid in this area. And remember what we talked about before about these cells, these pneumocyte cells. They help create surfactants. Okay, we've got a lack of surfactant now because we've got the fluid buildup. The cells aren't making surfactants, and we've got a reduction in oxygen. So ultimately, what's happening here is we've got an increased in respiratory effort. Oh dear, I can't spell. Okay, so that's the reduction in oxygen and also lack of surfactant and the fluid buildup. All affect your respiratory effort. Okay, so we have difficulty breathing. This is one of the first ways our breathing starts to become laboured, because we've got this lack of oxygen exchange and we've got this fluid buildup and lack of surfactant. Okay, now then, those interleukins and tumour necrosis factor, this immune response, has an effect on our wider circulatory system. Okay, so this is my anatomically correct drawing of a heart there. Okay, and these are our blood vessels. This is our circulatory system. What happens is you get something developing called SIRS. Okay, I have to remember how this one stands for as well. Here we go. It's called systemic inflammatory response syndrome. Okay, now as this condition develops, in the initial stages you've only got a few cells that are infected, but as the virus kind of spreads through the kind of the respiratory system and more cells are starting to become infected, that immune response also goes up as well. So it gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and you get more of these chemicals being released, and that has a wider effect over the whole body. Remember what I said, one of the things that happened was we get this increase in permeability of these blood vessels around our alveoli. Okay, that also happens around our full circulatory system. So essentially what happens is the fluid in our blood starts to leak out all over the circulatory system because we've got an increase in permeability. Okay, normally these blood vessels are nice and tight, there's not much fluid leakage. There is a little bit in different circumstances, but the fluid part of your blood stays within your blood vessels, the veins and arteries and capillaries. Okay, but what happens is these chemicals make, especially in your capillaries, or mainly in your capillaries, the cells start to become leaky and loose, and the liquid part can seep out and build up in these areas. So because we're losing fluid, this is basically fluid loss. We're losing fluid from our blood. So remember what we said right at the top. I'm going to whiz right to the top. What kills you is a reduction in blood volume. this is how your blood volume is reduced. The liquid part of your blood starts to move out of your bloodstream into your tissues. Okay, let's go all the way back down here. So we've got this increased permeability. We've got now a decrease in blood volume. Okay. Now, because your blood volume's decreased, guess what also happens? Your blood pressure also falls. Okay. And when your blood pressure is there to push blood through your capillaries and perfuse your organs with oxygen and blood, okay? So your blood pressure pushes blood through your capillaries so the oxygen can be delivered to your tissues, and your tissues can get rid of waste products, and that's then moved back around your venous system to your heart, and the system starts all over again, okay? But if you've got a reduction in blood pressure, that doesn't happen very well, so there's poor blood flow to your organs. I'm painting a pretty grim picture here, okay? And that blood, remember from earlier on, has a low oxygen saturation. That little P means kind of saturation, and low oxygen partial pressure, okay? So it has low oxygen level. So it hasn't got a lot of oxygen in there, so what is being delivered hasn't got a lot of oxygen, okay? And remember, all these tissues are now surrounded by fluid. So the actual delivery of oxygen is seriously impaired. Okay, oxygen has then got to get. If we draw, let's just draw. Let's say this box is an organ here. If fluid is built up in this area, it's going to be really difficult for oxygen to get through into that tissue. Okay, if we just had an organ here, normally the oxygen would be able to get across into that organ and those cells and tissues in there quite readily. But because we've got this build-up of fluid in this area, kind of between tissues and blood vessels and capillaries, okay, that delivery isn't very good. And ultimately, what's happening here, let's do this in red, is organs start to fail. Okay, so it's these things here. We've got a reduction in blood volume, so there's not much blood going around. The blood pressure that pushes the blood round is low, so there's not much pressure pushing blood to those capillaries. Okay, the blood that is being delivered has got a low oxygen level, and the tissues by those capillaries are now surrounded by fluid, so that delivery of oxygen is impaired, and ultimately your organs start to fail because of a lack of oxygen. Okay, and you could actually combine some other kind of secondary factors in here, because what you'd also have, because your oxygen levels are low, and these kind of systems are in place, you're actually starting to increase your rest rate, your breathing rate. That requires effort, and guess what? That uses more oxygen. Okay, so your respiratory muscles, the muscles in your neck, people are going to be using their shoulders, their intercostal muscles, their diaphragm more. Okay, it's going to be really hard for them to breathe. That's going to use more oxygen. Okay, their heart rate's going to be faster, so their heart is working harder. That's using more oxygen. Okay, so that is why you're seeing see patients being talked about being ventilated. The ventilation actually helps push air in and keep the pressure high. So we're trying to basically push and force oxygen, and get rid of all this off here a second. Here we go. Whee, like this. Okay, we're trying to get rid. So the high pressure with ventilation is basically trying to force oxygen across this really tough environment of fluid. Okay, that's what the ventilation's there. It's trying to basically force oxygen-rich air into your alveoli, keep the concentration really high so we can force it across that membrane, across that fluid, into your bloodstream to keep your saturation as high as possible, to give the patient as best chance as they can of survival. So it's not a massively happy picture I've drawn everyone there, but that is technically the kind of the basics of how COVID-19 affects our lungs and our organ systems, and ultimately can result in death. And typically in older patients and people with kind of secondary conditions, so people with heart conditions, respiratory conditions, this would be even worse for them because their organs are already kind of partly failing, and it has a bigger impact on them. Okay, so remember to stay at home, stay safe, protect the NHS and save lives. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. I'm not a virologist, but I can try and find out the answers for you and help answer some of those. Thanks for watching. Remember to share and tell your friends to watch the video if they really want a bit of a grim story on how COVID-19 affects the body. Until next time, we'll see you soon. Bye.